On the morning of the 19th of May, a battalion-sized Legion Fourth of infantry and armor, with a 6-pounder and mortar batteries, hastily patched together from the brigades that had fanned out in the northern West Bank, set out down the main road from Ramallah to the Old City. At Sheikh Jarrah and the police school, the legionaries brushed aside the IZL defenders, killing 6 and wounding 15, and proceeded southward, reaching the Old City's Damascus Gate in the afternoon. A link-up had been achieved, but the route from Shufat through Sheikh Jarrah and Musrara to the Old City was still enfiladed by Haganah and IZL. Light weapons and mortars from West Jerusalem's easternmost districts, and from the east, from the Hebrew University, Hadassah Hospital campus on Mount Scopus, a Haganah enclave in Arab territory. A Legion effort to break into Mount Scopus that day was repulsed by the Haganah, as were small armored thrusts westward into Sanhedria Beth Israel and Mandelbaum Gate areas. The main thrust at Mandelbaum Gate was beaten off with the 3 Legion armored cars disabled by a melange of Home Guard and Gadna. Haganah Youth Corps fighters brandishing a Piat and Molotov cocktails, supported by one Haganah armored car mounting a 2-pounder. The success boosted Yishuv morale, and the Haganah had demonstrated after the defeats in the Etzion block and the police school that the Legion's armor and artillery could be stopped. On the 20th of May, Legion armored cars attacked the Haganah and Gadna positions on the top floors of Notre Dame, which dominated the northern wall of the Old City. The Haganah soldiers seemed to be mostly little boys and girls of 15 or 16 and quite irresponsible, reported one British woman who was in the complex. But the legionaries failed, abandoning several burned-out cars hit by Molotov cocktails by the monastery walls. In all these attacks, the Legion was trying to secure the Ramallah Old City Road, or do nothing more than protect the Old City, as Kirkbride, briefed by Glubb, informed Whitehall. But Israeli leaders, including Ben-Gurion, not privy to Glubb's plans, interpreted the attacks as the start of an effort to penetrate and conquer West Jerusalem. Subsequently, Israel's Interior Minister, Yitzhak Gruenbaum, could not fathom why the Arab Legion, when it took Sheikh Jarrah, didn't proceed further. Had it continued, it is possible it could have conquered all of Jewish Jerusalem, or a large part of it. But we had a miracle. Gruenbaum assumed that conquering West Jerusalem was Jordan's objective. Indeed, the Israeli Prime Minister believed that the Jordanian invasion was part of a pan-Arab design, supported by Britain, to destroy within a few days the Jewish state. His suspicions went so far as to report, mistakenly, that the Legion was about to use British-supplied poison gas. Even the Anglophile and generally cool-headed Foreign Minister, Moshe Shertok, suspected Jordan and Britain of complicity in the unmistakable, inexorable line of crushing the Jewish state or reducing it to the minuscule 1938 Woodhead. Commission proposals, size and letting neighboring beasts devour large part of Palestine. The Legion push in Jerusalem and the Izadels' flight from Sheikh Jarrah had resulted in an order by David Shaltiel, the Haganah Jerusalem District OC, to all commanders to shoot anyone who was not obeying his orders or was trying to flee the battlefield. One reason the Yishuv leaders believed that the Jordanians were bent on taking West Jerusalem was the intermittent artillery barrages the Jordanians unleashed during the battles around the Old City. Although some shelling was directed at Israeli mortar batteries or government buildings, much was indiscriminate, and Jewish civilian casualties were extensive. Reporting from Jerusalem, a senior official, probably Walter Eitan, wrote that in the northern West Jerusalem neighborhoods there is scarcely a single home that has not been shelled, scarcely a family that has not suffered some loss in dead or wounded, and the inhabitants go hungry. One Hadassah hospital alone treated 1,000 shell casualties in the 2 weeks between May 15th and the 31st, because they are mostly poor people, people without influence. One does not hear much about this mass suffering. The war was not confined to the northern neighborhoods. At the southern edge of Jerusalem, hundreds of local irregulars were joined on the 19th of May by 800 Egyptian regulars and Muslim Brotherhood fighters. The van of the right arm of the Egyptian invasion via Beersheba and Hebron, and several platoons of legionaries. The combined force deployed 3 7-inch howitzers and 3-inch mortars and 6 armored cars. Their target was Kibbutz Ramat Rachel, which controlled the Jerusalem-Bethlehem road and the southern entrance to Jerusalem. For 3 days, the force bombarded the kibbutz, almost leveling it. Then, on the 22nd of May, after an infantry assault, the 80 wary and outgunned defenders abandoned the site and fled to Jerusalem. The Arabs systematically looted the buildings, then torched them. But that evening, in a surprise attack, 2 Haganah platoons from Jerusalem retook the kibbutz. The following day, the Arab forces retook the settlement, and that evening, the Haganah returned. The final battle began on the 24th of May. Again the Arabs attacked, but this time the Haganah force, reinforced by 50 Izadel members, held grimly onto the western half of the kibbutz. A company from the Harel Brigade arrived. The following day, the Arabs made one last effort and failed. The Palma, using flamethrowers, counterattacked that night, drove the remaining Arabs out, and conquered the nearby monastery of Mar Elias. The Arabs retreated to Sur Behir. In the week-long battle, there then 100 Arabs died among the Israelis. 26 were killed, and 84 were wounded. The Israelis had secured the southern entrance to Jerusalem. But the key to Jerusalem lay north of the city. The legion's position remained precarious. It firmly held only the area around the Damascus Gate, but the Ramallah-Jerusalem road was still enfiladed by Israeli fire, and the entrance to the Old City and its northwestern wall were dominated by the Haganah-occupied 500-room, stone-faced complex of Notre Dame. Glubb ordered the 3rd Regiment, which had deployed in Samaria, to head for the capital. For 6 days, its Bedouin soldiers had fretted and cursed in inaction around Nablus. Now, at last, they were joining battle. In the early morning hours of the 22nd of May, the regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William Newman, an Australian World War II veteran, dismounted from their trucks and advanced under a blazing sun from Shufat through Sheikh Jarrah to the old city's northern walls, all the while taking fire from the Haganah positions in Sanhedria, Mia Sherim, and Mount Scopus. The legion responded with artillery mortars and small arms. The whole area was enveloped in thick smoke. Many legionaries, now by now exhausted, went astray in the streets and alleyways north of the old city walls. But the corps of the 3rd Regiment, backed by gun-mounting armored cars, launched a desultory attack on Notre Dame. As the shells crashed into the stonework, the defenders moved from room to room and fired back. One of the cars was ignited and disabled by Molotov cocktails hurled by Gardner youths. The legionaries backed off. The next day, the regiment tried again. This time, it was a well-organized assault with infantry, armored cars, and artillery. The shells came thick and fast, as one compound resident noted, but the Holy Catholic Church seemed to have built for eternity, wrote Glubb. The Legion's 2- and 6-pounders and mortars were of little use against the stout walls. The infantry failed to enter the compound. A 25-pounder was brought up and fired point-blank. It felt like a continuous earthquake, recalled one of the defenders. An Israeli Piat knocked out 2 armored cars. At one point, a Legion company managed to penetrate the ground floor. The fighting was hand-to-hand from room to room. Both sides lobbed grenades and fired Tommy guns. The defenders, most of them 16- and 17-year-old Gadna youths, one, Mordecai Rottenberg, was 14, held on. Most of the regiment, pinned down by Haganah fire, failed to reinforce the penetration. In the end, Lieutenant Ghazi al-Harbi, a native of Saudi Arabia, and his 4th Company were ordered to withdraw. The Haganah reoccupied the ground floor. Fighting around the building continued for several hours. By evening, the Legion had had enough and withdrew to the Damascus Gate. The 3rd Regiment had suffered dozens of dead and wounded. Glubb later visited the regiment and met al-Harbi. The tears ran down his wrinkled and weather-beaten face as he begged for permission for one more try to take Notre Dame. "We'll do it this time, O Father of Ferris," he assured me, recalled Glubb. I vetoed any more attempts. But the regiment had managed to link up with the old city, and by May 24th, a continuous thin Legion line stretched from Ramallah through Sheikh Jarrah and the empty area between West and East Jerusalem. The battle had not gone all the Haganah's way. During the 14th to the 16th of May, the Jewish settlements of Atarat and Neve Yaakov, north of Sheikh Jarrah, were attacked by irregulars and Legion units, and abandoned, the defenders withdrawing to Mount Scopus. And on the 17th to the 20th, May, the military untenable settlements of Kelilah and Beit Ha'arava at the... Let's try that again. And on the 17th to the 20th of May, the military untenable settlements of Kelilah and Beit Ha'arava at the northern end of the Dead Sea, south of Jericho, were abandoned. The women and children left by air, and the rest by sea, southward to Sodom. But the most significant Israeli defeat occurred within the old city itself, with the fall of the Jewish quarter. Before the war, most of the inhabitants, almost all ultra-Orthodox, had been on good terms with their Arab neighbors, resented the Haganah presence, and were loath to see their homes sacrificed to Zionist heroics, as one British diplomat put it. Following an unsuccessful attack by Arab militiamen on the 11th of December 1947, British troops took up positions around the quarter, forming an outer cordon sanitaire around the Haganah defended perimeter. The British occasionally impounded Haganah weapons. On the 28th of March, there was a skirmish as the British tried to confiscate Haganah weapons. There were several dead, but the British stopped harassing the defenders. Until the 13th of May, when the British evacuated 90 men, mostly Haganah, had defended the Jewish quarter. In the following days, about 100 more joined them. On the 16th of May, Arab irregulars attacked the quarter, capturing several positions and mortaring the houses. Many inhabitants fled into synagogues and cellars. The quarter's rabbis demanded that the Haganah surrender. They feared a massacre. But Haganah Jerusalem headquarters ordered the defenders to hold on, promising reinforcements. The battle raged the next day, too. The defenders suffered heavy losses, and the Haganah was left with 10 bullets per rifle. But it held on. A Haganah effort on the 17th to 18th of May to break into the old city at Jaffa Gate was beaten off. But a simultaneous effort by the Herald Brigade, 4th Battalion, outside the southern wall, ended with the conquest of Mount Zion after fierce fighting inside the Dormition Abbey. The Haganah decided to exploit the success and take Zion Gate and link up with the besieged quarter. But the planning was slapdash, and the 4th Battalion was given insufficient reinforcements to carry it through. That night, of the 18th to 19th of May, a platoon of 24 exhausted Palmacheks, 2 of them women, led by David El Azar, IDF Chief of General Staff 1972-74, took Zion Gate after blowing in the doors with an 80-pound charge. The Arab defenders fled. A handful of Palmacheks, followed by 80 middle-aged Haganah conscripts, defined by the quarter's defenders as useless, carrying boxes of ammunition and extra weapons, reached the quarter. The small Palma force felt unable to hold the gate and the alley to the Jewish quarter, unless substantially reinforced. Owing to incompetence or a misunderstanding, Shaltiel failed to send the additional troops, and just after dawn, May 19th, the Palmacheks abandoned Zion Gate with a battle and returned to Mount Zion. For 5 hours, no one held Zion Gate. Indeed, 2 Israelis from West Jerusalem walked through it to the quarter, bringing food for their relatives. The area was quiet. No one stopped them, and they saw no one. Around noon, a Legion unit occupied the gate. Once again, the quarter was sealed off. Now it was seasoned legionaries, Abdullah Tal 6th Regiment, not disorganized Palestinian militiamen, who were doing the besieging. The assault on the Jewish quarter was renewed. The legionaries were assisted by irregulars, half of them ALA. The defenders were outnumbered 5-1 and completely outgunned. Starting on May 19th, the legionaries, heavily supported by cannon and mortars, steadily reduced the quarter. The attackers methodically blew up each house and position they conquered. Armored cars with 2-pounders were deployed in the alleyways. On the 22nd of May, the quarter's rabbis, Ze'ev Mintzberg and Ben Zion Hazan, cabled Israel's 2 chief rabbis. The community is about to be massacred. In the name of the inhabitants, this is a desperate appeal for help. The synagogues have been destroyed and the Torah scrolls have been burned. Misgav Ladakh Hospital is under a hail of shells and bullets. Save us. The Herald Brigade tried to break back in, but the attempts were poorly planned, undermanned, and half-hearted. Daily, the Legion broadcasts a demand to surrender, and by the end, most of the inhabitants were pressing the Haganah to accede. On the 26th to 27th of May, the legionaries took the Hervat Israel, or Herva, synagogue, the quarter's largest and most sacred building, and then, without reason, blew it up. This affair will rankle for generations in the heart of New Jewry, predicted one Foreign Office official. The destruction of the synagogue shook Jewish morale. Jerusalem Haganah headquarters ordered the defenders to hold on for a few more hours, but was unable to mount a serious relief effort. Israeli historians would later charge Shaltiel with incompetence and even indifference. But West Jerusalem itself was under siege. The Legion had blocked the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road at Latrun and Bab el-Wad, and he was extremely short-handed. He understood that the quarter was a sideshow, and its anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox inhabitants were not exactly the Haganah's cup of tea. On the morning of the 28th of May, a delegation of rabbis arrived at the quarter's Haganah command bunker and announced that they intended to surrender. The commander, Moshe Rosnak, agreed that they open truce negotiations. Glubb described what followed. Two old rabbis, their backs bent with age, came forward down a narrow lane carrying a white flag. In no man's land they met a Jordanian officer and said that they were empowered to negotiate. Tal demanded to see the quarter's Mukhtar, Rabbi Mordecai Weingarten. Weingarten, accompanied by his daughter, Yehudit, duly appeared, and the negotiations began in a nearby cafe. A brief ceasefire was agreed, and Weingarten returned to the Jewish quarter, where representatives of the inhabitants and the defenders voted almost unanimously in favor of surrender. Only the IZL representative abstained. Shaltiel was not consulted or informed. Rosnak, Weingarten, and Tal then signed an instrument of surrender. Tal agreed that the civilian inhabitants and all the women would be free to leave for West Jerusalem. Army-age mules or combatants would become prisoners of war. Seriously wounded combatants were to be set free. By then, of the 213 defenders, 39 were dead and 134 were wounded. The fears of the quarter's inhabitants proved groundless. The Legion had learned its lesson from Kfar Etzion. The legionaries deployed in force and protected the Jews from the wrath of the gathering Arab mob. The soldiers shot dead at least 2 Arabs and wounded others as they guarded the Jews. One POW recalled, "We were all surprised by the Legion's behavior towards us. We all thought that the soldiers, that is, Haganah men, none would remain alive. We feared a massacre, but the Legion protected us even from the mob. They helped take out the wounded. They themselves carried the stretchers. They gave us food. Their attitude was gracious and civil. The legionaries took prisoner 290 healthy males, aged 15 to 52, thirds of them, in fact, non-combatants, and 51 of the wounded. The other wounded and the 1,200 inhabitants were accompanied by the legionnaires to Zion Gate and freed. The quarter was then systematically pillaged and razed by the mob. The fall of the Jewish quarter, an important national site, dealt a severe blow to Yishuv morale. As the battle in Jerusalem unfolded, the importance of the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road and the vital sector at Latrun and Bab el-Wad dawned on the two sides, but the penny dropped first for Glubb. In Jerusalem, the fighting had ended more or less in stalemate. Israel held West Jerusalem, and the Arabs the eastern part of town, including the Old City. Glubb understood that if he was to continue holding East Jerusalem, and perhaps the West Bank as a whole, he must prevent the Israelis, who had a far larger army, from reinforcing the under-equipped Etzioni and Harel brigades. He had to block the road from Tel Aviv, and Latrun, Bab al-Wad, was the place where the narrow road begins the climb up through the Judean hills to the capital. Occupying Latrun, Bab al-Wad would also draw off or pin down Israeli troops who might otherwise be deployed in Jerusalem. The Israelis saw the situation in a mirror image. The Haganah feared that the legion was intent on conquering West Jerusalem or shelling the starving it into submission. Etzioni and Harel had to be reinforced and the city resupplied. The Haganah had to take Latrun, Bab al-Wad, and open the road, and some commanders no doubt thought about a further offensive stage in which the Haganah would conquer East Jerusalem and push down to Jericho and the Jordan, leaving the legion cut off and stranded in the West Bank. The small hillock of Latrun, topped by the large Taggart police force and the surrounding Arab villages of Latrun, Deir, Ayab, Imwaz, Yelu, and Beit Nuba, sat astride the junction of the Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Ramallah Magdal roads. The fort had been held from the end of April, when the British abandoned it, until mid-May by the units of the ALA and assorted militiamen. On the 14th of May, the Jordanians ordered al-Qawuqji, Qawuqji, don't care, to withdraw from the West Bank, and ALA pulled out. A platoon of left-behind legionaries of the 11th Infantry Company and dozens of Jordanian tribal militiamen under Lieutenant Abdel Majid al-May. Oh my. Listen to this. ABD, that's the first syllable, space, lowercase al, hyphen, uppercase MAJ, ID, space, lowercase al, hyphen, uppercase MAAITA. I'm not even going to try. Took over the Latrun fort. But the road to Jerusalem remained open. For 2 days, the Haganah failed to exploit the vacuum. And on the 17th of May, the door began to slam shut. Glubb ordered in the 4th Regiment, commanded by Habas al-Majali. The troops began to deploy between Bab al-Wad and Latrun that night. On the 18th of May, the road to Jerusalem was severed. Yeah, a lot could be said about transliterations when writing down these Arabic names. Like, that doesn't help. Like, when you have ABD, that doesn't help. Like, I mean, I don't know. Transliteration could be more when it's translated into English. That's just my take on it. Whatever. I guess it's one of those names you would have to hear to be able to pronounce. Simply reading it is just a clusterfuck. Anyway. Once again, West Jerusalem was besieged and under dire threat along its eastern edges. The legion was mounting continuous attacks. Ben-Gurion feared a collapse. He demanded that the Haganah take Latrun and all the surrounding villages and break through to Jerusalem. It was to be the first time Israel breached the tacit non-aggression agreement with Abdullah. The area had been earmarked by the United Nations for Arab sovereignty. During the following weeks, Israel made 3 major efforts to take Latrun, and failed each time, with heavy losses. And in the end, the IDF built a bypass road that demonstrated that the attacks had not, after all, been necessary, and that an alternative supply route to Jerusalem was available. The HGS hastily assembled a plan to task force. The 7th Brigade, in charge of the operation, had been slapped together from scratch during the previous fortnight. Its men and officers were poorly trained, and its equipment were seriously deficient. The 7th was in no shape to take on the Legion, and the state of Alexandroni's 32nd Battalion, loaned to the 7th for the attack, was not much better. It arrived at the assembly point, Kibbutz Holda, at the last minute. Shlomo Shamer had some 2,400 troops with 12 armored cars, 10 3-inch mortars, and 2 65mm field artillery pieces. The Haganah went in blind. Its eve of battle intelligence spoke of irregular local forces rather than a Legion presence. In fact, by the evening of the 24th of May, the 4th Regiment had been joined by the 2nd Regiment, commanded by Major Geoffrey Lockett. The area had turned into a reduced brigade redoubt, the 4th Regiment holding Latrun village and fort and the neighboring villages of Imwaz, and the 2nd Regiment deployed immediately to its east between Beit Nuba, where its 2 batteries of 25-pounders were dug in, and Yalu and Deir Ayub to the south. The 2-regiment brigade, the 3rd commanded by Colonel Teal Ashton, consisted of 2,300 soldiers plus 800 auxiliaries, with 16 3-inch mortars, 8 6-pounders, 10 2-pounders, 35 armored cars, half of them with 2-pounders, and the 25-pounders. Israeli scouts had noted the arrival of the new battalion, but the information had failed to reach operation headquarters. Yadin sensed his forces' unreadiness. He tried to obtain a postponement, but Ben-Gurion refused. The Prime Minister, acting the Generalissimo, feared a collapse in Jerusalem. Within hours or days, he ordered Yadin to go ahead. Though not optimistic, the Haganah commanders believed that surprise and the fact that the main assault would take place at night, when the Legion's artillery would be less effective, would offset the Jordanians' obvious advantages. The operation was condemned. Bin Nun, after Joshua bin Nun, who had commanded the Israelite forces battling the Canaanites at the same spot, the Ayalon Valley, some 3,200 years before. In command was O.C. 7th Brigade Shamir. The soldiers were told that they were tasked to save Jerusalem. Two battalions, the 32nd and the 7th Brigades, 72nd, were to go in, with the 73rd in reverse. All were unready in almost every way. There was only meager artillery support. 2 pre-World War 165mm French mountain guns, 4 homemade Davidka heavy mortars, which failed to work, and a battery of 81mm mortars. There was no armor. Only a quarter of the 32nd's soldiers had canteens. Ammunition as was low. There were few light mortars and machine guns. And only part of the 73rd Battalion was at Huldah. The rest was still equipping southeast of Haifa. But their defeat was assured by another factor. The 32nd and 72nd set out 5 to 6 hours later than planned, which meant that the battle would take place in daylight. The 32nd's B and A companies were ordered to sweep undetected south of Latrun and head northward, taking the hilltops overlooking Latrun village and Imwaz. If successful, the battalion was then to loop westward and take Latrun village and the police fort. Meanwhile, the 72nd Battalion, in a wider southeasterly sweep, was to take the chain of hills to the southeast, eventually conquering Deir Ayyub and the hilltops overlooking Bab el-Wad. In effect, the plan called for a frontal attack on a well-entrenched brigade complex. The attack never really took place. The 32nd and 72nd Battalions crossed the starting line at 3 to 4 a.m. on foot, moving parallel to and just south of the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road. 1st Platoon B Company, 32nd Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Ariel Arik Sharon, acted as point. An hour after setting out, B Company was spotted just south of Latrun village and hit by Legion mortars and artillery. A company to their south was also hit. With sunrise, the Jordanian fire became extremely accurate. The Israelis had no answer. The battalion took heavy casualties. Hiding behind rocks, both companies replied with light weapons ineffectively. Equally ineffective was the brigade artillery, which was out of range for counter-battery fire. The 72nd Battalion, moving a half-mile or so to the south of the 32nd, was hit by artillery from Legion positions at Latrun and Deir Ayyub, and by hundreds of Arab militiamen who, summoned for the kill from nearby villages, engaged them from the south. The sun was up, and it grew hot. The 32nd Battalion veteran later described what happened. We took a heavy Jordanian barrage, the likes of which I had never experienced. The shelling had a terrible effect. All my men were new immigrants. They lost their heads. Some shouted to retreat. Others pleaded for water. The wounded were covered in blood. The gnats and the hasmin, that is, the hot eastern desert winds, in the Yalon Valley were almost as bad as the artillery. Terrible was the cry of the new immigrants, many of whom were Holocaust survivors. Wasser, wasser, water, water, they shouted. The barrage ignited the brush, adding smoke to the melange. In both battalions, the cry went up to retreat, and in disorderly fashion. Groups of soldiers began to turn back, some carrying wounded and dead, sprinting from rock to rock, hiding behind folds of earth. A company, the 32nd Battalion, managed to establish a temporary position on a slope south of the main road, from which it opened up on the Jordanian positions near Latrun village, and on squads of legionaries who sortied south of the road to pick off the Israelis. Jordanian artillery ranged in on the slope and hurried the retreating troops. At 11:30 a.m., Shamir, who never left Holda and lost control over his units, issued a general order to retreat. But the brigade's artillery cover was completely ineffectual, as Jordanian casualty figures were to demonstrate. It was 95 degrees Fahrenheit with 38% humidity. The retreat under heavy accurate fire, with many already dead and wounded, and some overwhelmed by thirst, was difficult and disorganized. Many soldiers discarded their equipment. The Jordanians were later to collect 220 rifles, dozens of Stein guns, and 15 machine guns. Among the seriously wounded was Sharon, hit in the stomach and leg. He later recalled numbing Ima mommy. He was eventually pushed, mumbling Ima. Sorry. Among the seriously wounded was Sharon, hit in the stomach and leg. He later recalled mumbling Ima, or mummy. He was eventually pushed and dragged to safety by a badly wounded 16-year-old subordinate. Jordanian irregulars, screaming Iba Idba al-Yahud, slaughter the Jews, pressed southward from Latrun and northward from the village of Beit Susan in an effort to surround and pick off the Israelis. Shamir ruled against sending his few armored vehicles into the killing fields. A handful of Israeli machine gunners, with great heroism, stayed put and kept the irregulars at bay as the 32nd survivors ran and crawled their way to safety. Some noted witnesses were in such a stupor that they walked upright, slowly, as if oblivious to the machine gun fire and shells. Arab irregulars and legionaries killed off stragglers. By late afternoon, most had reached safety, or had been picked up by rescue squads in cars and armored vehicles. Alex Androni had suffered 52 dead. The 7th Brigade, 20 dead. The Legion took 6 prisoners. About 140 Israelis were wounded and saved. The dead included some killed off or left to die after the legionaries and irregulars had occupied the battlefield. The Legion and irregulars suffered no more than 5 dead and 6 wounded. Ben-Gurion wrote, "The blow was so harsh that also those not physically injured were badly affected. It was a very bad blow." Israeli intelligence subsequently was full of praise for the Legion's performance, noting especially the quality of the infantry and mortar crews, but the Jordanians failed to exploit their success and attack the headquarters at Holda, which they could easily have done. Nonetheless, the defeat left the lasting scar on the psyche of the IDF General Staff, and conversely, a feeling of elation among the Jordanians. The road remained closed, and West Jerusalem on the verge of starvation, as the city's military governor Dov Yosef wrote to Ben-Gurion, "I don't want to add to your difficulties, and I'm trying to keep up the morale of the inhabitants, but we have food left for only a few days." The Legion was wary of an Israeli follow-up attempt and asked Iraq and Egypt to help out. Both sent aircraft to strafe Israeli positions west of Latrun, and the Iraqis launched a local assault at Gulim near Netanya, which the Haganah command initially interpreted as an effort to drive to the sea and cut Israel in two. The Egyptian advance from Majdal to Isdad during the 27th to 29th of May, see below, may also have been, at least in part, a response to the Jordanian request. But the Israelis were not to be deflected from a second try. The 7th Brigade was eager to neutralize the effects on morale and unit prestige of the debacle. More important, West Jerusalem cried out for relief, especially after the fall of the Jewish quarter. And there was an international political imperative. On the 29th of May, the UN Security Council issued a call for a 4-week ceasefire, which threatened to freeze the front lines from the moment it went into effect. Ben-Gurion feared that if the road remained blocked, the political settlement that might follow would leave West Jerusalem outside the Jewish state. The road had to be opened. The 7th Brigade, now reinforced by the 52nd Battalion, Givati Brigade, which replaced the disseminated 32nd, which had been returned to Alexandroni, had 5 days to plan a second attack. But again, it incorrectly assessed the Jordanian deployments. It failed to fathom the quantity and quality of the Legion's positions in the Yalu, Deser Ayab sector, held by the 2nd Regiment, and the operational planning was defective. In effect, the Haganah repeated the first attack, Again, instead of mounting a brigade-sized attack on the key objective, the Latrun fort, the Israeli assault was diffuse. The plan called for an eastern effort by the 72nd Battalion and the 52nd Battalion, an experienced infantry force, setting out from Beit Susan to take Deir Ayoub and Yalu, from there hitting Latrun village from the east, and the western effort by the 71st and 73rd Battalions to take the fort and Latrun village from the northwest. This time, Operation Bin Nun Bet. It would be a night attack. At about midnight, on the 30th to 31st of May, the Eastern Arm silently crossed the road at Bab al-Wad, and, dividing in two, began the climb on foot to Deir Ayyab, 72nd Battalion, and Yalu, 52nd Battalion. They hoped to achieve surprise. One company passed through Deir Ayyab, which was empty, but then, climbing the hillock, overlooking the village, the site of the tomb of Job was spotted by Jordanian sentries, and all hell broke loose. Grenades and light weapons, artillery, and machine gun fire poured down on the Israelis. 13 men were killed and several wounded. The company, mainly composed of new immigrants, broke and ran, retreating southward to Bab al-Wad. Meanwhile, the 52nd Battalion on the right prepared to assault the spur, artillery ridge, just above Yalu. But the Eastern Arm's headquarters, hearing of the shambles at Deir Ayyab, ordered the battalion to pull back, which it did in ordinary fashion, taking only a handful of casualties from Jordanian gunners. By dawn, it too was back in Bab al-Wad. The eastern arm of the offensive had failed. Meanwhile, at Latrun, the main western arm got under way with an artillery barrage on the fort and the village. The mixed column, the 73rd Battalion, was half-tracks, 2 mounting flamethrowers, and armored cars, some with cannon, and 71st Infantry Battalion achieved tactical surprise. Again, though, the effort was dispersed, with 1 unit heading toward the fort, and 2 companies heading towards eastward for Latrun village, and the wood around the adjoining Trappist monastery. The efforts against the village and the monastery were successful. The monastery fell, as did about half the village, pinning down Legion forces that could otherwise have been sent to aid the fort. Nonetheless, the fort, the main objective, proved too much. Though the initial omens were good, a preliminary artillery barrage effectively neutralized the guns inside the complex. The legionaries deployed 2-pounders on the roof, and the Israeli armored column, composed of 5 half-tracks and several armored cars, an infantry platoon, and sappers, breached the perimeter fence and reached the fort's walls, spewing fire from the flamethrowers. For a moment, the defenders, legionaries, and militiamen were stunned, but the flames afforded clear targets for their 6-pounders overlooking the fort and grenades. One by one, the half-tracks burst into flames, including the one carrying Hadasha Lempel, the radio woman who was keeping HQ abreast of the battle. She died. The sappers, with 550 pounds of explosives, managed to blow a hole in the fort's outer wall, but the accompanying infantrymen, in the confusion, did not follow through, and the sappers were eventually overpowered and killed in the ground floor rooms, the defenders shouting, "Allahu Akbar." The operation commander, Chaim Laskov, ordered his reserves, D Company, 71st Battalion, to join in. But as they disembarked from their buses at the assembly point, a soldier accidentally detonated a mine. 3 soldiers died, and several were wounded. The rest of the company, uncertain about what happened, panicked and fled westward. The explosion attracted heavy Jordanian artillery fire. Colonel Mickey Marcus, the American volunteer and advisor who had just been appointed head of Central Front, summarized, "Artillery cooperation was okay. The armor was fine. The infantry was very poor. The battle was not yet over. Israeli companies still had a foothold outside the fort and in Latrun village. But the news from the eastern arm at Deir Ayyub was bad, and most important, dawn was fast approaching. Laskov understood that even if his troops somehow took the fort and village, they could not hold out against a daylight Legion counterattack backed by artillery. He ordered a retreat, directing it from a nearby field. He was the last to leave the area. He later recalled, "I didn't want to come back. I wouldn't have. I no longer cared. If they shot me, they shot me." Suddenly, the American photographer, Robert Capa, arrived with a canteen full of brandy. We sat together, we drank. He said, "Mickey Marcus orders you back. I couldn't go. I couldn't understand Jews retreating, fleeing. I couldn't do it." And then Capa said, "Mickey told me to tell you that what this nation now needs is honor, integrity, and justice. Move back." So I went back. The 73rd Battalion had suffered about 50% casualties. Altogether, the 2 arms of Bin Nun Bet had 44 dead and twice that number wounded. Legion casualties are unknown. The Legion's main loss was Lieutenant Al-Mayata, the fort's commander, killed either during the battle or in an artillery strike in its wake. The IDF made one more major attempt against Latrun on the 8th of June, codenamed Operation Yoram. The 7th Brigade, sent to the rear to reorganize, was replaced by the Yifta Brigade. This time the General Staff decided on a consecrated 2-battalion night attack by Harel's 5th Battalion and Yifta's 3rd Battalion. In the seam between the Legion's 4th and 2nd Regiments, a 3rd Battalion was to provide decoy sorties around the 4th Regiment's perimeter. The 5th Battalion was to take the major position, Hill 346, overlooking Latrun, and Imwaz from the east. The 3rd Battalion was then to pass through it, take nearby Hill 315, and attack Latrun village and fort. The operation kicked off with a barrage of 4 65mm cannon and 4 120mm mortars on the fort. Latrun village and surrounding positions, Hills 346 and 315, each held by a company of the 4th Regiment, were left untouched to avoid alerting the Legion. The 5th Battalion set off on foot from Bab al-Wad, took the wrong wadi, and mistakenly approached 315. Near midnight, the 4th Regiment's sentries spotted them and opened up. The whole front came alive with illumination rounds and artillery. The 5th Battalion pushed up the slope and, in hand-to-hand combat, successfully took 315 two-packs, but the Legion subjected them to withering fire from neighboring positions and then counterattacked. The battle continued for hours, the legionaries even calling down artillery on their own positions. The 5th Battalion sustained heavy casualties. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion, which had set off an hour late, began its climb. It lost eye contact with the 5th Battalion. When it finally reached the slope of 346, it expected to find the 5th Battalion in place. Instead, it was met by small arms fire and grenades, then artillery. The battalion radioed HQ and asked that the 5th be told to cease fire. The 3rd assumed that the 5th took them for Jordanians, but HQ refused to believe that this was what was happening, and the 3rd Battalion's radio man failed to raise the 5th directly. So the 3rd Battalion held its fire and stayed put. It didn't understand what was happening and had no way to solve the problem. It was night, and all around were the sounds of battle from the 5th Battalion engaged on Hill 315, and from Yifta's raids along the 4th Regiment's perimeter at Salbet, Imwaz, and Bayat Nuba, which caused little damage but sowed consternation in the Legion Brigade HQ. The 5th Battalion had taken a key position at the center of the 4th Regiment's perimeter, causing a partial retreat of legionaries from nearby positions. The confusion in Jordanian ranks was probably as great as among the Israelis, but Yifta HQ decided to call it a day. With daylight fast approaching and without a clear picture of what was happening, in addition to the 5th Battalion reporting heavy casualties and the 3rd Battalion still out of the fight, Yifta HQ probably had little choice. 3rd Battalion was ordered back to Bab al Wad, and at 5:30 a.m. the 5th Battalion was also ordered to retreat. It did so under Jordanian harassment, carrying its casualties through rocky mountainous terrain to safety. The 400-man battalion had suffered 16 dead and 79 wounded, all from the lead 2 companies. The 3rd Battalion suffered a handful of dead and injured. The Legion suffered several dozen casualties. Operation Yoram had a painful for the Israelis appendage. On the 10th of June, with the UN imposed truce to begin the following day, the Legion mounted a last-minute raid. Perhaps it was a private initiative of the British 3rd Brigade officer Captain T.N. Bromage. A battalion-sized force, composed of legionaries and irregulars with a dozen armored cars, attacked Kibbutz Gezer. The settlement was defended by 68 Haganah members, 13 of them women. After a 4-hour fight, the assaulting force, shouting Der Yassin Abu Shusha, overrun the kibbutz. A dozen defenders managed to flee. Most surrendered. 1 or 2 were executed. The legionaries protected the rest from the irregulars. The next day, the legionaries released the female prisoners. Altogether, 29 Haganah men and 2 legionaries died. The settlement was looted by the irregulars and neighboring villages. The large IDF forces in the area had failed to intervene because of poor communications. That evening, after the legionaries withdrew, Yifta troops retook the kibbutz from the irregulars. Operation Yoram had been, in a very real sense, superfluous. There had been no overwhelming need to capture Latrun. On the 10th of June, an alternative supply route to West Jerusalem was fully functioning, skirting south of the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem Road and Latrun, the Burma Road, named after a road that bypassed Japanese positions in the Far East in World War II, followed a series of dirt paths linking the Israeli-held abandoned villages of Deir, Muhazin, Beit Ziz, Beit Jiz, Beit Susan, Beit Masher, and Saris before returning to the main road at Nev Ilan. again. The Burma Road, named after a road that bypassed Japanese positions in the Far East in World War II, followed a series of dirt paths linking the Israeli-held abandoned villages of Der Muhezrin, Beit Jiz, Beit Susan, Beit Mashur, and Saris before returning to the main road at Neve Ilan. The possibility of an alternative route had first surfaced 3 weeks before, when Palma scouts had hiked from Kiryat Anavin to Hulda without encountering Arabs. On the 28th of May, the Haganah occupied Beit Jiz and Beit Susan. Their capture, in effect, gave the Haganah a continuous corridor from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The problem would be to render the stretch south of Latrun transport worthy. On the night of the 29th to 30th May, on the night of the 29th to the 30th of May, I'm just going to start, okay, I don't like this. I'm going to stop saying the two dates when they're talking about the night of the 29th, which followed into the 30th of the morning. I'm just going to say the first date. It's so stupid. 29th to 30th. Like he doubles up on, just because they're night assaults, right? So you divide up the dates between the 29th and the 30th. So, on the night of the 29th of May, two jeeps, one from the Harel Brigade heading westward and the other from the 7th Brigade heading eastward, met just south of Bab Awad. During the following days, while engineers flattened out the rocky steep stretches, jeep convoys from Hulda hauling 65mm cannon and mortars reached the outskirts of West Jerusalem. The Jordanians heard the engineers and convoys, and from Latrun sent salvoes of artillery and patrols to disrupt the work. But these efforts were half-hearted and unsuccessful. Still, though useful in moving equipment, the rough route did not solve West Jerusalem's civilian supply problem, which grew more acute by the day. Starting on the 5th of June, IDF engineers began resurfacing the route for civilian trucks. By the 10th of June, it was ready. Thereafter, a steady trickle of trucks reached the capital. At the same time, an alternative water pipeline was laid from Naon to Bab Awad, and from there to Jerusalem, replacing the old pipeline that the Jordanians blocked at Latrun. By the end of the first month, both sides, though licking their wounds, were generally satisfied. Partition, as they had envisioned back in November 1947, had taken place. Abdullah had taken control of much of Arab-populated eastern Palestine, stretching from Jericho to Lydda, Ramlah in the west, and Tulkarm, Nablus, and Jenin in the north. He had also managed to save East Jerusalem for the Arabs and take the Jewish quarter, and had administered severe setbacks to the Yishuv. The Haganah, IDF, for its part, had managed to deny the Legion a toehold in West Jerusalem, and despite defeats in Latrun, had found a solution for resupplying Jerusalem. It had held its own against a professional British-led army, and more important, had regained the initiative. The Jordanians were to remain completely on the defensive for the rest of the war. Both sides had managed to avoid a war to the finish. Indeed, the Legion had avoided attacking the territory of the UN partition plan, Jewish state, but the Legion had suffered serious losses. One intelligence source put them at some 300 dead and 400 to 500 wounded, and its stocks of ammunition, particularly for artillery and mortars, were extremely low. The minuscule Legion could ill afford such a level of casualties or ammunition expenditure. By August, the Legion had shells left for only 5 days of combat. Indeed, for the 6 25-pounder batteries, the mainstay of its artillery, it had only 2,000 shells left. And Glubb had no idea if and when more shells, more mortar bombs, and bullets would arrive. Jordan and its patrons in London henceforward lived in constant fear of the IDF, that the IDF would turn its attention eastward and encircle and destroy the Legion, which all understood was the main prop of the monarchy as well as the only serious obstacle to Israeli conquest of the West Bank. On the other hand, the IDF, 5 times larger than the Legion and steadily resupplied from Czechoslovakia, more than made up for its losses in men and ammunition. Within weeks, the IDF was far stronger than it had been on the eve of the battle with the Legion.